Hi everyone, and welcome to Bridging the Gap. I'm your host, Kelly Lovell, and this week we're joined by our expert guest, Snyder, and he'll be talking with us about fine-tuning our marketing skills. Sean is the founder and president of Trend Trunk, Canada's leading fashion marketplace and award-winning startup company. As seen on the popular TV show Dragon's Den, Trend Trunk is an app and web-based platform that allows consumers and brands to buy and sell mid to high fashion and accessories in simple, social, and secure way. Sean is also the vice president of sales for Exchange Leads, and recently he started a new marketing venture called Engagement Agents. Suffice to say that Sean has had quite the experience and journey in marketing and lead generation and startup life. So I'm pleased to have Sean joining with us today. Thank you again, Sean.
Hi, great. Thanks, Kelly, for having me. Much appreciated.
Could you start us off by perhaps sharing a little bit more about your journey and how you ended up where you are today?
Sure. It's a bit of a long story and roller coaster, but I'll try to keep it a short roller coaster. I actually grew up in Hamilton, graduated from Mohawk College in marketing, wound up getting into the corporate world for a couple of years, worked for a great company called CNC Global. Couple of years went by and I got, as I call, bit by the entrepreneur bug. Had a great idea, as everybody does, quit my job, found some business partners, started my first company called Preferred One, which was at the time the first coalition loyalty program cashback card in Canada, if not North America. So consumers could buy, when they bought stuff at certain retailers in the GTA area, they'd earn a percentage back as cash instead of getting points. And that quickly evolved into what became one of the largest gift card marketing companies in Canada. And we grew the business to about $40 million a year in sales, which was huge. And it was the hockey stick that everybody talks about, or I guess dreams about. When I exited that, I eventually wound up starting Trend Trunk, which, as you mentioned, is one of the largest, or the largest fashion marketplace in Canada. So letting women buy and sell the clothing in their closet. And I'm now working on my next venture called Engagement Agents, which is a platform that allows retailers to easily distribute their marketing campaigns to the malls and shopping centers that they're in efforts to get more consumers engaged and coming to the mall and shopping and spending their money.
I wanted to touch a little bit more about that because I find the landscape in terms of marketing and such obviously has changed drastically over the years. And I think in your career you've seen that evolution, but you seem to have always been kind of on the front end pushing that next thing. How do you feel the marketing landscape has changed, or how we should be prepared now to flip our strategies?
Well, I think a lot of it, from my experience, and I mean, keeping in mind when I started getting into sort of e-commerce, I mean, it was still relatively in its early days, and especially there was nobody really at the time selling physical pieces of plastic, aka the gift cards, online. And I think from my perspective, a lot of it's just evolved from trial and error. I mean, I know everybody's focused on digital this, digital that. In all the businesses that I've started, there's always been a component of physical or traditional marketing and advertising, which I believe has been critical to our growth and our success in my past companies and even the one I'm working on today.
And when you say traditional marketing and advertising, what do you define as that? Is that like cold calls? Is that like mail outs? Is that in person? What is that?
Good question. So, I mean, there's obviously a gamut of different things, but from my perspective, it would be everything from calling and talking to people, meeting people at an event, done a lot of different, whether it's business trade shows or consumer-facing trade shows, mailing, which, as everybody knows, obviously there's a cost associated with the print and then actually getting it out there with postage. Even sort of guerrilla marketing, so feet on the street, maybe at a high traffic area of a city that you're handing out stuff, or just anything sort of traditional, which I guess people would consider sort of old school, but I think it's an integral part of the mix, because at this point, I don't think a lot of companies, and you see the Amazons of the world doing print advertising in a newspaper, taking out full page ads. And you see a lot of companies that are mixing the offline and online, or I guess, as the word goes, either it's phygital or omni-channel.
Hmm. Well, I think it's an interesting conversation because I think it is a little bit of a trying to find your happy medium or sometimes just finding your fit. I know, for example, with my tech startup, for example, like we've struggled with things like cold emails and cold calling. Every time you get someone on the phone, they say send you an email, and then your emails, they ignore the emails, you struggle with them going to junk or with the different kind of spam laws depending on where your location is. And so more and more social selling becomes a trend. But when you look at social selling, it's just as easy to kind of get lost in that noise. So I guess my question would be for our listeners out there who may be kind of also struggling with kind of finding that fit or that that go-to strategy. Maybe it's not necessarily the go-to strategy, but is there a strategy maybe to help better cut through that noise or be more effective at those strategies?
That's a great question and something I debate all the time. I mean, I think the challenge is being on both sides, right? Because you, as I am, as everybody else, I mean, we're either in some capacity probably trying to introduce something that we're doing to somebody else, or we're obviously consuming something that somebody's introduced to us. And I mean, I go through it all the time, right? Where you have a great conversation with somebody, follow up, you may or may not get a response, and you try different tactics or different email subjects to find out, maybe what's working and what's not working. And obviously, I think, I can probably speak for anybody that's in sales. I mean, that's obviously one of the fun and frustrating parts of sales. But once you do get that opportunity and you're pumped and you're excited because you've got that relationship formed and you've got that sale, I mean, it's a party. But I think at the same time, when people approach me, I guess what I'm trying to do obviously is be mindful, because I know that they're probably going through the same challenge that we all face. So it's just, in terms of the clutter out there, I don't really think, I think if anything, it's just getting, worse and worse, if you will, or just more challenging, because everybody's getting bombarded. And, not just respectfully talking about work, but obviously everybody's got their 5 to 9, if you will. So whether it's their family or their friends or their social life or other activities that they do outside, and everybody's trying to directly or indirectly pitch something, if I can call it that. So I think it's just really, at the end of the day, I guess I can kind of try to boil it down and say it does truly come down to, I think, persistence, and I do think sort of the relationships.
And do you have then your go-to platform, like one that you tend to use the most?
For marketing?
Yeah, or I think in general, like looking, for example, at Trend Trunk and how you've done phenomenal with the company and certainly have a lot of high growth with it, whether it's marketing or whether it's just taking a startup and getting it off the ground. What are kind of that go-to channel that we should be maybe devoting a little bit more time to in getting those first clients or reaching those customers?
Oh, okay. I think if I could sum it up into one word, but I guess it's technically 2 words, is I'll say, the grind. So it's grinding. It's a lot of just hard work and persistence. And as I think every entrepreneur will say, how many times they've got the door slammed in their face, but they keep pursuing and pushing and moving forward. Because I really don't think at the end of the day that there's any one silver bullet, if you will. I think it's a bunch of little tiny bullets that eventually make up one big silver bullet, and it's really just trial and error. So there's, for me personally, I mean, there's a lot of learnings that I've had on my way of with my first business, Preferred One, and what worked and what didn't work there. Which then, when we started Trend Trunk, it was a lot much faster to get going, and obviously we. I like to say, learn from our mistakes and what we did in the past to say, oh, we're not going to do that again because here's what happened last time we did it. So we're going to try something else. So I think it's just iterative processes that eventually lead you to sort of those right marketing channels, which again, some might work for some companies, some might others. I've read companies where their whole business is based on communication between customers and SMS, right? Like they don't have any website transactions, no e-commerce, everything's literally done through an SMS messaging platform, which is amazing, but that just kind of shows you how times are changing. But that necessarily wouldn't work for my business if I just said tomorrow, okay, I'm, doing away sort of with the e-commerce and the transactional parts and just moving to completely SMS. So I think it's really at the end of the day, whatever the company, or if it's a business to business type of company, or it's a B2C, or it's a B2B2C, really depends on, I think, where their customers are to decide what's the best avenue. Like it could be that you go to a trade show once or twice a year, and that's where you're getting that's where you're drumming up all your business.
Well, that is true. I think taking a deeper look into your customer mindset is really key because, for example, we may be like, I'm thinking particularly for young founders, we may think, well, kind of social and digital is everything. No one does direct mailers anymore. But if you're targeting maybe a retired community as your ideal customer, I know quite a few that still religiously check their mailboxes for their coupon books and for their flyers and things like that. So depending on what your market is, some of your channels that you may think are traditional or outdated may actually still be very relevant, and vice versa. Some of the more digital channels, like I think that's so creative, actually using texting as a way to communicate with your group, knowing that if you're working with a really young group, they might actually enjoy that better. So yeah, I think you make a good point that it really kind of depends more on the customer rather than the time of year, so to speak, in terms of where our society is at.
Yeah, and I do think, for example, I went to a presentation on retailers and e-tailing and omnichannel, and one of the retailers was talking, and they were just really talking about the evolution of the customer, and really now it's the times have changed where it's not anymore, I'm a retailer and I have this in my store, so you come to me. It's really gone 360, and now it's basically, they were saying, here's the customer, and they could be anywhere. They could be on, the street, they could be at our store, they could be across the country, they could be on social media. And how do we now, as the retailer, go to those customers? So if that customer's thinking of our product, we're there for them wherever they are, versus forcing them to, hey, you've only got to go to our website to buy, or you can only come into our store and buy. And I think that's really, at the end of the day, to what we're talking about, the customers, and really, as a lot of people say, the customer journey is really, where are the customers? But they're all over, right? So it's just trying to find and do the, the testing, or the A/B testing and different versions and whatnot, to find what really gives you the most bang and or the most efficiencies for what you're trying to accomplish.
And I want to touch a little bit further on that. With some of your experiences in developing, we can touch on your new business, but also with Trend Trunk, because with that, I find finding those early adopters sometimes is a struggle for new entrepreneurs and young entrepreneurs when we're first starting out. We have this great idea, we want to bring it to life, and we have maybe the strategies in place, but getting that actual customer buy-in is a hurdle. And for our listeners out there, I think to give them a little context of what Trend Trunk does is essentially you're selling the clothes that are in your closet. So clothes that you don't wear anymore, you're able to sell those to others. I always think of it kind of like a Kijiji kind of style for clothing. It's really awesome. And so how did you go about getting those initial ambassadors and scaling that?
Well, it's a top secret, so it's classified. No, but in all seriousness, I mean, and I can't tell you necessarily what exactly worked just because we were doing, again, a bunch of trial and error. I mean, we left no stone unturned. I know a couple things that were effective for us were, especially getting out there, is we actually did quite a few partnerships with the monthly subscription box type businesses, which were complementary to us. So for example, you may be getting a monthly subscription of makeup and cosmetics. So obviously we know that you're, most cases you're a woman, and then that's obviously who we were targeting at the time with Trend Trunk. So we put in, for example, gift cards into the subscription boxes. So when you got your monthly makeup box, you got this little surprise from this company called Trend Trunk, which seemed to work fairly well for us. We've been very involved in the fashion community and or charity and nonprofit group, and that is something that's personally near and dear to my heart just from my past company with Preferred One, because we raised about $5 million for different charities and nonprofits across Canada. So I'm, personally and professionally very interested in helping the social cause and the social aspect and building a social responsibility portion into any of the businesses I create. So we were fortunate to build a lot of great relationships with different community organizations across Canada and support them, whether it was at their big gala of the year or their fundraising fashion event or any other sort of relevant events that we thought would be mutually beneficial for us and obviously the organization. So I'd say those are probably a few of the interesting things we did. And in most cases, those are both very traditional because you were either physically at an event or you were physically printing out something and giving something to somebody. It wasn't sending a bunch of emails out and the spray and pray approach. So those were, and I think also a lot of the parts of the traditional in some respects is I think, I guess subconsciously I'll say maybe there's a lot of people that when they see something physical, it becomes a little bit more believable because I think there's so many, there's so many websites out there and you can do so many different things that I think if you're walking hypothetically, let's say by a bus shelter, not that I'm a proponent of bus shelter advertising, but if there's something that's physical there that you can see or somebody hands you something, I think that gives you a little bit more of a touchy-feely, if you will, which then I think maybe subconsciously leads to a bit more, okay, this thing exists, even though I have to go online to do whatever it is, there's something that's physical and tangible that I got and it's in my face versus just seeing a banner ad or something like that. So it really depends, I think, at the end of the day, where you can touch the customer at the best time.
Well, I think that literally as well in terms of touch. I think you're right in the sense of starting to bring things a little bit more physical when we live in such a digital world is not is certainly a creative strategy and one that probably deserves a little bit more merit in terms of its effectiveness. You do tend to see things when they're physically present, or you can, like you said, you can hold it, you can touch it, you can see it, a lot different than a quick little ad that you see fly by on the screen, because I think we become accustomed to ignoring those and kind of glancing over those a little bit more quickly. So that is a really good strategy and technique. Looking back, you've mentioned this a couple times that some of it's been trial and error and finding your way. Looking back, is there a moment or like one mistake, so to speak, that you did do that was one of those learning moments for you that you would be able to share with us?
There's probably a lot of them, but in the efforts of time, we could probably spend all day talking about mistakes. I'd say probably my first learnings from, again, going back to my first company, because we had such a huge growth, I'd probably say the one thing that we didn't take into account, and I really think in all honesty, it's tough for any business to do this because you don't necessarily know it and I don't think you could plan for it, which was a fortunate situation for us to be in, was the huge growth and not necessarily having all the proper, I'll say, systems or infrastructure, or in some cases, the right team members in place to handle that growth. Because I think when we did grow so quickly, I guess all joking aside, I kind of like to think that we really got caught with our pants down. So, we went from, for example, in 1 year, we went from $80,000 in sales to the next year was 1.3, which was a huge growth, and then just exponentially grew from there. But when it's at least for me, when it's your first business and, you're young, and you're maybe junior or naive to some of the stuff and the reality, once you start getting that kind of volume going, you really need to start putting in different or proper or upgrading your infrastructure, your capabilities, or again, your team, which is obviously a critical part, because what maybe 5 people were doing at volume X, you can't necessarily have those 5 people doing the same at volume Y, because proportionately, you probably just need more people to handle the extra sales or the extra fulfillment or the extra customer service or the extra development or manpower or whatever. So I'd probably say that was the biggest learning, which then when starting Trend Trunk, and what I was mentioning earlier is that I felt that I took a lot of those learnings and it helped to get Trend Trunk going a lot faster, because I knew what I would need to have in place at sort of relatively reasonable timelines and what the expectations would be and what the reality was, right? Because you obviously go into something and you think, okay, well, we might need, again, I'm just making stuff, we might need 2 people to handle this one thing, whereas in reality, those 2 people might need another 2 people. So now all of a sudden you need 4 people, which obviously then comes at a greater cost, in both not only salaries and all the other things with it, but it also comes at a cost to the business, because if 2 people respectfully can't handle the work of 4, then they're not going to be happy, obviously, personally and professionally in the company. And maybe the customers aren't going to be happy because they're not getting the level of service that you're claiming to commit to or ideally wanting to commit to. So there's ripple effects, whether they're, I guess I'll say, visible or invisible in some capacity, which again, you may or may not know that they're going to be coming at you, but eventually they will. So I think that, again, kind of would be probably the biggest learning that I've sort of taken away in growing. And, each one as every day goes by and every learning comes in, you get that, hopefully that much smarter and that much savvier to be more efficient in what you're doing.
I think that's a really good point, because I've experienced those growing pains myself, and I think it comes in almost building a mindset for growth, but building that in at the beginning of, like, not just trying to get to the finish line, but knowing that it's a marathon and that's just one of the stops on the finish line, and there's still quite a bit to go. So not to just stop and celebrate and then drop everything when you hit that first milestone.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good, and again, probably something that a lot of companies or a lot of individuals, I mean, including myself, don't do is also sort of celebrating those little wins, right? Because I think every entrepreneur wants to obviously go faster than either they can or their team can or the market will let them go, which, again, I can't speak obviously for every entrepreneur, but I know personally speaking, that's obviously always frustrating, because you want to get something done now, but you may not just have the cycles to do it, or something, whether it's a potential customer or technology, or you're relying on some other company or person, is and not in a bad way, but just general, nature sort of takes its course and something's preventing you from getting to that finish line faster. But I do think that it's also important, whether it's yourself personally or with your team, to celebrate those little wins, right? And not forget, what you've accomplished to that. And just, keep, as you kind of said, building on to the next part and the next part, because it is, as you said, a marathon.
As you're describing that, I'm thinking of kind of like so developers, they work in kind of sometimes what is called an agile mode. And so for an agile mode, you have an end kind of project or goal, but each goal is broken up into weekly or bi-weekly sprints. So at the end of each sprint, you're supposed to have like a working product or a working completed component of your larger goal, and then you get to demo it and show it to the team, and then you move on to your next piece. So very much to your point, kind of knowing that the journey, the marathon, so to speak, has many parts, but then, like you said, also kind of taking that time to acknowledge how far you've come.
Exactly.
With that in mind, and looking at some of the learnings that you've had in your journey, and then comparing that also to marketing, what is your biggest pet peeve that new marketers should avoid?
Boy, that's an interesting question, right? Because I'm on sort of the dishing it out and receiving it, so I have to be careful what I say. I think the one thing that is something that's been on my mind as of late, and again, I've read different feedback from people about it, whether it's on LinkedIn or different blog posts, is I think one of the challenges with, because everybody's so busy, it's how do you, to this point about get through the clutter, but coming from a sales perspective, is the challenge is, if you follow up with somebody and you have a great conversation, and let's say they tell you, for example, to send a proposal or send more information, and you do, and you follow up, and it's kind of, I guess, which is a common term out there, but ghosting, if you will, in the sense of the dating word. But I've read a lot about people talking about, I guess, business ghosting, where no different, right? You have this great conversation, and then all of a sudden the potential customer doesn't respond, or I'll say, disappears. So I think from a relationship standpoint, and again, realizing that everybody's busy, I think that's a little bit of a pet peeve on the marketing side about how do you, I guess if I can say, not necessarily earn the respect, but how do you at least either keep that door open, or I guess formally close that door and say, okay, I've gotten the hint, if you will, and let's move on to the next opportunity. But it's tough when you have that great conversation with somebody and they seem enthusiastic because you're obviously enthusiastic, and then days and weeks and months go by and there's really no closure, whether it's hey, we're not interested, or hey, we're ready to go, and what's the next steps.
Yeah, I like how you mentioned the formal close of the door, because I think sometimes we're always so focused on opening the door and pushing leads. But I've learned recently the power and the value of someone of actually just at least knowing that the door is closed. Because like you said, sometimes you can waste weeks or sometimes months, depending on what type of client that is, on trying to foster that relationship and keep that door open. And if they're really not interested, or they don't see that deal closing, let's say because of their budgets and fiscals, until maybe another fiscal, telling you that and telling you to close that door can actually be really valuable, because then you have the time to go on to actual leads that probably can open their doors, I should say.
Yeah, or I mean, even to that point, if it's at least even from my perspective, right? Because again, all of us as entrepreneurs or salespeople have gotten the door, quote unquote, slammed in our face, and not maybe in a hard way, in a nice way. But it's also, even if there is, as you said, for whatever the reason is I find that there's often a lot of cases, and I've quite honestly probably done it myself, where it's, hey, we're not interested. And I think it's, I'll say appreciated, or even a good opportunity to try to get that feedback from the person and say, okay, great, you're not interested. Can you tell me why, right? Is it, whether it's cost, or is it, I don't know, resources, or whatever the reason is, so that as the salesperson or the company that's trying to sell the product to the potential buyer, at least you've kind of got that information the next time around to either say, oh, maybe we didn't realize what this could be another barrier for other companies we talk to, or maybe I've had in some cases, again, quite candidly speaking, where there's been some sort of miscommunication where maybe the client thought something, and in their, let's say, email or conversation, that kind of comes to light, and there's an opportunity now to correct that. I don't want to say confusion or assumption, but versus just saying no and that's sort of the end of it. But again, I've probably been on the other end of it as well, where I've been maybe not giving as much information. So I try to be more mindful of that as well.
Yes, well, certainly. And I think that correcting of assumptions is very common, actually, particularly if you're new and you're starting off with a concept that isn't quite yet fully understood or easy to understand, just because of the nature of the innovation you're doing. You'll run into people trying to kind of lump you in and with what they already know. So oftentimes that can relate to assumptions of what you actually do and who you actually are. So yeah, probing a little bit further sometimes can actually reopen that door just because they closed it too quickly.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, but then this goes back to kind of the initial thing we were saying earlier about, and respectfully, people are busy and they get bombarded with a lot of, whether it's calls or emails or meeting requests or things like that. And I think it's, just admittedly probably human nature to kind of process something quick and get on and move on to the next thing. And you're exactly right. If you're potentially pitching something that's different or new or it's innovative, I think most people will, by default, maybe lump it into bucket number A or bucket letter A, B, or C, and you might be, you may or may not be, right? Like at the end of the day, maybe you are in bucket C, but you think you're in bucket D because you're your own new bucket. But at the end of the day, you obviously want to have that opportunity to talk to the person and tell them what's different, and obviously, like you said, address any concerns or assumptions that are there.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any final last thoughts or advice for young entrepreneurs as they're pondering these same struggles that we're discussing now and trying to find that market fit and getting that relationship built with the customers, or just rising above that noise? Any final, any leaving thoughts for them?
There's probably a few. I mean, I think, again, which everybody wants to do and tries to do, and I think they should do, is probably, standing out. I mean, one of the things that we did, for example, with Trend Trunk, which was a bit unique and a bit risky, but I think it sort of paid off pretty well, was, and I don't know if you had an opportunity to look at the video, as I mentioned earlier, that you mentioned that we were on Dragon's Den. And as part of our sort of pitch to the Dragons and to create some sort of, laughter and humor and whatnot, literally on TV, I came out of the closet. So they wheeled me in a closet and I popped out of the closet, and that was kind of my pitch. And you could see it got some engagement on Twitter. People were talking and saying we had the most quote unquote epic entrance ever on Dragon's Den. Which I think left a great impression, right? So I think at the end of the day, if you don't have that opportunity to sort of close that deal, I think, as we were talking earlier, build that relationship, leave a great impression. It is, as we were talking about before, I mean, it's a grind. So there's obviously the ups and downs of the roller coaster, and there's probably, as most of us can attest, there's probably more downward hills than there are upward hills. But in terms of, just the grind and grinding it out and being passionate and persistent, I think I guess I'll say passionate, persistence, and perseverance are probably the three things.
I love that. They're my 3 P's to success. Yeah. Perfect way to end it off for sure. Sean, it's been a pleasure to have you on Bridging the Gap. I appreciate your insights. For those of you listening, now it's your turn. What do you think? Add your thoughts to the discussion using the hashtag Bridging the Gap on Twitter, and give this podcast a thumbs up if you like some of the advice Sean has shared. Thank you for listening, and remember to check back Thursday for our next chat. Together we can start bridging the gap between industry and youth. Thank you again, Sean, for joining us.
Thanks very much, Kelly. I really appreciate it.